In the shadowed halls of the Chateau de Varennes, under a haunting harvest moon, a scream pierces the night. Madame Héloise de Varennes lies dead, a dagger in her heart, her priceless emerald necklace vanished. Hercule Poirot, with his unrivaled little gray cells, steps into a web of greed, secrets, and betrayal. A desperate heir, a radiant actress, a vengeful doctor, a covetous rival, and a secretive scholar. All hide motives as dark as the chateau's hidden vault. As clues unravel, sedative-laced wine, a scrap of silk, a drop of wax, Poirot races against time to unmask a killer before the moonlight fades. Who struck the fatal blow? The truth awaits in this thrilling tale of murder and mystery. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Lyon. In the waning days of October 1934, Hercule Poirot sat in his impeccably ordered London flat at Whitehaven Mansions, the faint aroma of his morning tisane mingling with the crisp scent of autumn seeping through the window. The Belgian detective, his mustache waxed to perfection, was a picture of precision. His patent leather shoes gleamed, his tie was knotted with mathematical symmetry, and his little gray cells, as he so fondly called them, were restless for want of a problem. The Morning Post, delivered with punctual efficiency by his valet George, lay neatly stacked on the mahogany desk. Among the usual correspondence, a request for a lecture, a polite refusal of a social engagement, sat an envelope of thick cream vellum, embossed with a golden crest in the shape of a fleur-de-lis. Poirot's green eyes narrowed as he slit the envelope with a silver letter opener. The letter was penned in an elegant, if slightly tremulous, hand, and bore the signature of Madame Héloise de Varennes, a French widow of considerable wealth and a fleeting acquaintance from a case some years prior in Paris. The contents were brief but intriguing. An invitation to a weekend gathering at her chateau near Lyon, nestled in the verdant Rhône Valley. The tone, however, carried a shadow of unease. "My dear Monsieur Poirot," it read, "your reputation for unraveling the most perplexing of mysteries precedes you. I find myself troubled by certain irregularities in my household. Shadows move where there should be light, and I fear I cannot trust my own eyes. Your presence would bring me great comfort, and perhaps your little gray cells might discern what I cannot." Poirot leaned back, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. The vagueness of Madame de Varennes' words was a challenge, a whisper of intrigue that stirred his curiosity. A chateau, a widow, and an undercurrent of suspicion. What better stage for the exercise of his intellect? He penned a swift acceptance, arranged his travel with characteristic efficiency, and within 2 days found himself aboard the Orient Express, bound for Lyon. As the train carved through the French countryside, the harvest moon hung low, casting a silvery glow over fields and vineyards, and Poirot's mind buzzed with anticipation. The Chateau de Varennes stood as a monument to grandeur, its turrets piercing the twilight sky, its stone facade softened by ivy and moonlight. A liveried footman greeted Poirot at the gates, and he was ushered through a courtyard fragrant with late-blooming roses to the chateau's entrance, where Madame Héloise de Varennes awaited. She was a woman of 60, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her silk gown a testament to timeless taste. Yet her blue eyes, sharp as sapphires, betrayed a flicker of disquiet as she clasped Poirot's hand. "Monsieur Poirot, you are most welcome," she said, her voice warm but strained. "I fear this gathering may not be as convivial as I hoped, but your presence reassures me." "Madame," Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "Hercule Poirot is at your service. The shadows you speak of, they shall not elude me." She led him into the chateau's grand hall, where crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across marble floors and tapestries depicting medieval hunts. The guests, already assembled, were a curious ensemble, each radiating a distinct air of personality and purpose. Madame introduced them with practiced grace. First was Julien de Varenne, her nephew, a man of 30 with the easy charm of a Parisian boulevardier, but eyes that darted with the unease of a gambler in debt. His tailored suit was impeccable, yet a faint stain on his cuff suggested carelessness, or nerves. Next came Mademoiselle Clara Beaumont, a rising star of the French stage, her auburn hair cascading in waves, her laugh a touch too bright as she sipped champagne. Her emerald green dress clung to her like a second skin, and her glances toward the other guests carried a theatrical intensity. Dr. Henri Fournier, a lean man in his 40s with a physician's reserved demeanor, stood apart, his dark eyes scanning the room as if diagnosing its occupants. Madame Sophie Lambert, an art dealer with a sharp tongue and sharper cheekbones, wore a severe black gown adorned with a single ruby brooch, her gaze lingering on a Renaissance painting above the fireplace. Lastly, Monsieur Victor Morel, a scholar of medieval history, seemed almost part of the chateau's decor, his tweed suit and spectacles blending into the wood-paneled walls as he clutched a worn notebook. The household staff, too, caught Poirot's attention. Gustave, the butler, moved with the silent efficiency of one long accustomed to service, his face an unreadable mask. Annette, a young maid with wide, nervous eyes, hovered at the edges, her hands twisting in her apron when she thought no one watched. Dinner was served in the dining room, where candlelight danced on silver and porcelain. The conversation, however, was less harmonious. Julien pressed his aunt for an advance on his allowance, his tone half joking, but edged with desperation. "Tante Heloise, surely a small sum could tide me over," he said, earning a tight smile from Madame. Clara, meanwhile, leaned toward Dr. Fournier, her laughter ringing as she recounted a theatrical triumph, though Poirot noted the doctor's polite but distant responses. Sophie made a barbed remark about Victor's dusty manuscripts, prompting a flush to creep up the scholar's neck. Madame de Varenne, presiding at the head of the table, seemed to shrink under the weight of the discord, her fingers tightening around her wine-glass. Poirot, seated to her right, observed in silence, his fork poised with precision, his mind cataloging every gesture, every inflection. The emerald necklace at Madame's throat, a de Varenne heirloom, he recalled, gleamed like a beacon, drawing covetous glances from Sophie and a fleeting frown from Julien. As the meal ended and the guests retired, Poirot lingered, noting the hour. 11 o'clock. The moon was high, bathing the chateau in a spectral glow. He had just reached the staircase when a piercing scream tore through the silence, echoing from the direction of the library. Poirot's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of a mystery unfolding. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "The curtain. It rises." Chapter 2. The Body in the Library. The scream that had shattered the moonlit stillness of the Chateau de Varenne reverberated in Hercule Poirot's ears as he hastened down the grand staircase, his small, precise steps belying the urgency of the moment. The great hall, moments ago a stage for candle-lit civility, now pulsed with alarm as doors creaked open and footsteps converged toward the library. Poirot, his mind as sharp as the edge of his meticulously waxed mustache, reached the heavy oak doors first, pushing them open with a decisiveness that silenced the gathering guests behind him. The library was a cavern of shadows, its high shelves laden with leather-bound volumes, the air thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Moonlight streamed through tall, mullioned windows, casting a silver sheen across the scene that awaited. There, in a high-backed armchair by the fireplace, sat Madame Héloise de Varenne, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her silk gown stained crimson. A dagger, its hilt ornate with filigree, protruded from her chest, and her lifeless eyes stared into eternity. The emerald necklace, that radiant heirloom which had gleamed so vividly at dinner, was gone. Poirot's green eyes swept the room, cataloging every detail with the precision of a watchmaker. The fire had dwindled to embers, but a broken wineglass lay on the Persian rug, its contents pooling in a dark stain that mingled with the blood. A single shard glinted near the armchair, catching the moonlight. The dagger, he noted, matched a set displayed in a glass case on the wall, though one slot now stood empty. The nearest window was slightly ajar, its latch undone, but the gravel path outside showed no trace of disturbance under the pale glow of the moon. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the chill of the October night. The guests crowded at the doorway, their faces a gallery of shock and suspicion. Julien de Varenne, his handsome features pale, clutched the doorframe, his breath reeking faintly of brandy. Clara Beaumont, her theatrical poise shattered, pressed a trembling hand to her lips, her green dress shimmering like a beacon in the dim light. Dr. Henri Fournier stood rigid, his physician's detachment failing to mask a flicker of unease in his dark eyes. Sophie Lambert, her ruby brooch glinting, surveyed the scene with a cold curiosity that Poirot found unsettling. Victor Morel, clutching his notebook as if it were a shield, seemed to shrink into the shadows, his spectacles reflecting the moonlight. Gustave, the butler, hovered at the rear, his impassive face betraying a slight tremor, while Annette, the young maid, stifled a sob, her eyes wide with horror. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, raising a hand to still the murmurs. "No one must touch anything. The truth, it lies in the details, and we must preserve them." He knelt beside Madame de Varenne, his gloved fingers tracing the air around the dagger without disturbing it. The wound was precise, a single thrust to the heart, suggesting both intent and strength. The broken wineglass intrigued him. Its jagged edges suggested it had been deliberately smashed, not merely dropped. The stain on the rug, he noted, carried a faint chemical odor, distinct from the wine's bouquet. He rose, his gaze lingering on the empty slot in the dagger case, then turned to the open window. The absence of footprints outside was telling. Either the killer had not fled, or they had never left. A commotion at the entrance announced the arrival of Inspector Émile Dubois of the Lyon police, a burly man with a weathered face and a mustache that rivaled Poirot's in volume, if not in elegance. His arrival was swift, summoned by Gustave, who had telephoned the authorities moments after the scream. Dubois, familiar with Poirot's reputation from a prior case in Marseille, greeted him with a nod of respect. "Monsieur Poirot, it seems fate brings you to another tragedy. What have we here?" "A murder, Inspector," Poirot replied, his voice calm but laced with steel. Madame de Varenne, killed with a dagger from her own collection. The emerald necklace is missing, and the scene, it speaks of calculation, and perhaps panic. Dubois surveyed the room, his eyes narrowing at the guests, who stood like statues under his scrutiny. "No one leaves the chateau," he declared. "Monsieur Poirot, will you assist?" "With pleasure," Poirot said, his lips curving slightly. "Let us begin with the accounts of those present." The questioning commenced in the drawing-room, where a fire was hastily lit to ward off the night's chill. Poirot and Dubois sat at a rosewood table, the guests summoned one by one. Julien de Varenne went first, his charm replaced by a nervous energy. "I was in my room," he insisted, running a hand through his dark hair. "After dinner, I had a few drinks, brandy, you know. I heard the scream and came running." His eyes darted to the side, and Poirot noted a faint tremor in his hands. Clara Beaumont followed, her actress's poise returning as she spoke. "I was in the conservatory, practicing lines for my next role," she said, her voice clear but her fingers twisting a silk handkerchief. "The scream startled me, and I rushed to the library." Poirot's gaze lingered on her dress, recalling the scrap of silk he had noticed caught in the library's window frame. He said nothing, but his gray cells hummed. Dr. Fournier was next, his demeanor clipped and professional. "I was in the study, reviewing medical journals," he said, meeting Poirot's eyes steadily. "I heard the scream and arrived shortly after Monsieur Julien." Poirot noted the doctor's calm, but also the absence of any journal in his hands when he entered the library. Sophie Lambert, her voice sharp as cut glass, claimed she was in the chateau's gallery, admiring a Titian painting. "I have an eye for beauty," she said, her lips curling faintly. "I was alone until the scream brought me downstairs." Her composure was flawless, yet Poirot sensed a guardedness in her posture. Victor Morel, pale and stammering, said he was in the tower, immersed in his research on Lyon's medieval history. "I was studying manuscripts," he muttered, clutching his notebook. "The chateau's history is complex." Poirot's eyes narrowed at the scholar's unease, wondering what secrets the tower held. Gustave and Annette, questioned together, vouched for each other. "We were in the kitchen preparing for tomorrow," Gustave said, his tone steady. Annette nodded, her eyes red from crying. "We heard the scream and ran to the library," she whispered. Poirot noted their loyalty, but wondered if fear, not grief, drove Annette's tears. As the interviews concluded, Dubois reported that the dagger bore no fingerprints, wiped clean, and the wine-glass shards were being analyzed for traces of anything unusual. Poirot paced the drawing room, his mind a whirl of details. The missing necklace, the open window with no footprints, the broken glass, the precise wound. "The killer," he said softly to Dubois, "is among us, but the motive, it is not yet clear. The necklace, it is a distraction perhaps. We must look deeper." The inspector nodded, impressed by Poirot's clarity. As the guests retired to their rooms under police watch, Poirot lingered in the library, his eyes fixed on the armchair where Madame de Varenne had met her end. The moonlight cast long shadows, and in their patterns, Poirot saw the first threads of a web he would unravel with the relentless logic of his little gray cells. Chapter 3. The Shadows of Motive. The dawn broke over the Chateau de Varenne with a pallor that seemed to mourn its mistress. Hercule Poirot, ever an early riser, stood at the window of his guest room, his eyes tracing the mist that clung to the Rhône valley like a shroud. The events of the previous night, the scream, the lifeless form of Madame Héloïse de Varenne, the missing emerald necklace, had set his little gray cells into a frenzy of activity. Murder, he knew, was never a solitary act. It was a tapestry woven from the threads of human desire, fear, and deceit. His task was to find the pattern. After a breakfast served in strained silence, Poirot began his inquiries with renewed vigor. The dining room, where last night's tensions had simmered, was now a stage for guarded glances and hushed tones. Julien de Varenne picked at his croissant, his eyes bloodshot from more than just lack of sleep. Clara Beaumont, her theatrical radiance dimmed, sipped coffee with a distracted air. Dr. Henri Fournier maintained his clinical reserve, though his fingers drummed faintly on the table. Sophie Lambert, her sharp features accentuated by the morning light, seemed to appraise the room as if it were an auction house. Victor Morel, buried in his notebook, avoided eye contact, his pen scratching furiously. Gustave and Annette moved with mechanical precision, their faces betraying nothing beyond dutiful service. Poirot, impeccable in a charcoal suit, began his investigation in Madame de Varenne's private study, a room of understated elegance with a walnut desk and shelves of family records. Inspector Dubois, his mustache bristling with purpose, joined him, producing a key found in the housekeeper's possession. It unlocked a hidden drawer in the desk, revealing Madame's will, penned in her precise hand. The document was a revelation. Her fortune, vast and meticulously detailed, was to pass to Julien, but only on the condition that he abandon his profligate ways and prove himself worthy within a year. Failure would redirect the estate to a distant cousin in Bordeaux. A codicil, added recently, promised a substantial sum to Clara Beaumont, described as a dear protégée. Poirot's eyebrows rose. "The motive, it begins to take shape," he murmured, handing the will to Dubois. Next, Poirot wandered the chateau's corridors, his patent leather shoes silent on the polished floors. He paused at the portrait gallery, where ancestral de Varenne gazed down with haughty permanence. Sophie Lambert was there, studying a canvas with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Poirot approached, his voice soft but probing. "Madame Lambert, you admire the art, or perhaps something more?" She turned, her ruby brooch catching the light. "The de Varenne collection is exquisite," she said, her tone measured. "Héloïse and I shared a passion for beauty, though we differed on its ownership." Poirot pressed gently, learning that Sophie had once claimed the emerald necklace as a family heirloom. Stolen, she believed, by Héloïse's late husband during a disputed estate settlement. Her bitterness was palpable, but she denied any violence, her eyes flashing with indignation. In the conservatory, Poirot found Clara Beaumont, her auburn hair glowing in the sunlight filtering through glass panes. She was rehearsing lines, her voice trembling not with grief but with nerves. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, his tone disarming. "You were close to Madame de Varenne, oui?" Clara admitted to their bond, confessing that Héloïse had funded her theatrical career, seeing in her a spark of brilliance. "She was like a mother," Clara said, tears welling, though Poirot noted their swift appearance. He recalled the silk scrap from her dress, caught in the library window, and filed the observation away. Dr. Fournier was in the garden, inspecting herbs with a clinical eye. Poirot joined him, noting the physician's steady hands capable of wielding a dagger with precision. "Doctor, you knew Madame well?" Poirot inquired. Fournier's jaw tightened as he admitted to a past disagreement. Eloise had invested in his clinic, but withdrew her support after a financial misstep, leaving him resentful. "I bore no grudge," he insisted, but his eyes avoided Poirot's. Victor Morel was harder to find, tucked away in the chateau's tower, surrounded by manuscripts and maps. His research, he explained, focused on the de Varenne lineage, particularly a legend of a hidden vault containing treasures lost during the French Revolution. Poirot's interest peaked at the mention of the vault, but Victor's nervous stammer and refusal to elaborate suggested he knew more than he shared. "The past, it holds many secrets," Poirot said, watching Victor's face pale. The maid Annette, intercepted in the kitchen, proved a valuable source. Her youth and fear made her candid. She revealed overhearing a heated argument between Julien and his aunt before dinner, with Julien pleading for funds to settle gambling debts. Madame was firm, Annette whispered, glancing at Gustave, who was polishing silver nearby. She told him he'd get nothing unless he changed. Poirot thanked her, noting Gustave's subtle nod, as if confirming her story. As noon approached, Poirot reconvened with Dubois in the library, where the air still held the faint metallic tang of blood. The inspector reported that the wine-glass shards had been sent for analysis, suspecting a sedative, and the dagger's lack of fingerprints pointed to a careful hand. Poirot examined the room again, his gaze lingering on the fireplace. A faint smudge of ash on the hearth caught his eye, a detail overlooked in the night's chaos. He crouched, peering at it, and found it was not ash, but a trace of green thread, fine and shimmering, like the fabric of Clara's dress. He slipped it into an envelope, his mind racing. Returning to the drawing room, Poirot requested Gustave's account of the evening. The butler, his composure unwavering, described locking the chateau's doors at 10, as was custom, and retiring to the kitchen with Annette. Yet Poirot detected a flicker of hesitation when asked about Clara's movements. "I saw Mademoiselle Beaumont near the library stairs, perhaps at 10:30, Gustave admitted, "but she said she was fetching a book." Poirot's mustache twitched. Clara had denied entering the library, yet the silk scrap and Gustave's testimony suggested otherwise. As the afternoon waned, Poirot stood alone in the garden, the chateau's turrets looming against a sky bruised with clouds. The motives were emerging like stars at dusk. Julien's desperation for his inheritance, Clara's expectation of a bequest, Fournier's resentment, Sophie's claim to the necklace, Victor's secretive research. Yet the method, the sedative, the dagger, the missing necklace, suggested a crime both planned and impulsive. The truth, Poirot mused, it hides in the spaces between what is said and what is seen. He resolved to probe deeper, to stir the waters and watch what surfaced. The chateau, with its ancient stones and whispered secrets, held the key to Madame de Varenne's death. Poirot's little gray cells, relentless and precise, would not rest until the shadows of motive were brought into the light. Chapter 4. The Moonlit Alibi. The twilight of the second day at the Chateau de Varenne draped the estate in a veil of mystery, the moon rising once more to cast its ghostly light through the tall windows. Hercule Poirot, his mind a whirl of deductions, stood in the grand hall, his small frame dwarfed by the towering portraits of de Varennes ancestors. The green thread from the fireplace, the missing necklace, the sedative-laced wineglass, all were pieces of a puzzle that demanded assembly. Tonight, he resolved to test the alibis of the chateau's inhabitants, to probe the cracks in their carefully constructed facades. After a somber dinner, where the guests' forced civility barely masked their unease, Poirot summoned them to the drawing-room. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the damask walls, and the air was thick with anticipation. Inspector Dubois, his weathered face set in a scowl, stood by the door, his presence a reminder of the law's watchful eye. Poirot, impeccable in his black evening suit, paced before the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back, his green eyes gleaming with purpose. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice soft yet commanding, "a crime has been committed in this house, and the murderer is among us. Each of you claims to have been elsewhere when Madame de Varennes met her tragic end. Yet the truth, it is like the moonlight. It reveals what the shadows conceal. I ask you now, who among you stood in the moonlight last night?" A ripple of unease passed through the room. Julien de Varennes, lounging in a velvet armchair, shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around a cigarette. Clara Beaumont, her auburn hair catching the firelight, sat rigid, her eyes darting to the window. Dr. Henri Fournier folded his arms, his physician's calm strained by a faint crease in his brow. Sophie Lambert, her ruby brooch glinting, met Poirot's gaze with a defiant tilt of her chin. Victor Morel, clutching his notebook, seemed to shrink into his chair, his spectacles reflecting the flames. Poirot turned first to Clara. "Mademoiselle Beaumont, you said you were in the conservatory, practicing your lines. Yet Gustave, the butler, saw you near the library stairs at 10:30, and this—" He produced the scrap of green silk, holding it delicately between gloved fingers. "This was found in the library window frame, torn from your dress, non?" Clara's cheeks flushed, her theatrical poise faltering. I did go to the library," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I wanted a book, a volume of Shakespeare. I opened the window for air. It was stuffy. But I swear, Madame was alive when I left." Her eyes, wide with desperation, sought sympathy, but Poirot's expression remained inscrutable. He turned to Julien. "Monsieur de Varennes, you claim you were in your room, drowning your sorrows in brandy. Yet Annette, the maid, saw you descending the staircase toward the library shortly before the scream. What say you to this?" Julien's cigarette trembled as he exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Annette must be mistaken," he said, his voice edged with irritation. "I was in my room, as I said. Perhaps I stepped out for a moment, to clear my head. But I didn't go near the library." His defiance rang hollow, and Poirot noted the sweat beading on his forehead. Dr. Fournier was next. "Doctor, you claim to have been in the study, reading medical journals. Yet no journal was found in your possession when you entered the library after the scream, and your knowledge of sedatives, such as might have been in the broken wineglass, raises questions, does it not?" Fournier's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "I am a physician, Monsieur Poirot. I know of sedatives, yes, but I had no reason to harm Eloise. My journals were in the study. I left them there when I heard the scream. You may verify this." His calm was convincing, yet Poirot sensed a guardedness beneath it. Sophie Lambert, her posture erect, faced Poirot's scrutiny with a cool smile. "Madame Lambert, your claim to the emerald necklace is well known. You were in the gallery, you say, admiring a painting, yet your obsession with the necklace, it suggests a motive, non?" Sophie's laugh was sharp, like the clink of crystal. "I wanted the necklace, yes, but I am no thief, nor a murderer. I was in the gallery, as I said. Eloise and I had our disputes, but I would not stoop to violence." Her confidence was unshaken, but Poirot noted the slight clench of her fist. Victor Morel, last to be questioned, stammered under Poirot's gaze. "Monsieur Morel, you were in the tower, lost in your manuscripts. Yet your research on the chateau's hidden vault intrigues me. Did you seek something more than knowledge last night?" Victor's hands shook as he adjusted his spectacles. I study history, Monsieur Poirot. The vault is a legend, nothing more. I was in the tower, as I said, working late." His voice lacked conviction, and Poirot's eyes narrowed at the scholar's unease. Inspector Dubois, scribbling notes, reported a new finding. The wine-glass shards, analyzed in Lyon, contained traces of chloral hydrate, a sedative. "It suggests," Dubois said, "that the killer intended to incapacitate Madame before striking." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The sedative pointed to premeditation, yet the dagger's use suggested a sudden act. The missing necklace, too, was a puzzle. Stolen, yet not the primary motive, he suspected. Poirot dismissed the guests, their alibis fraying like worn tapestry. Alone with Dubois, he paced the drawing room, his thoughts aligning like stars. "The alibis, they are like a house of cards," he said. "Each stands only because the others do not contradict it directly. But the green thread, the sedative, the dagger, they tell a story of their own." He requested a thorough search of the chateau, focusing on the tower where Victor worked. "The scholar, he knows more than he says," Poirot mused. "And the library window, it was opened not for air, but to suggest an outsider. Yet no outsider was here." As the guests retired under Dubois' watchful eye, Poirot returned to the library, the scene of the crime. The moonlight, now filtered through gathering clouds, cast a fainter glow, but it was enough for Poirot to notice a detail overlooked in the chaos. A single drop of wax on the windowsill, as if a candle had been held there briefly. It was unscented, unlike the chateau's usual tapers, and its presence struck him as deliberate. "The little gray cells, they see what others miss," Poirot whispered, slipping the wax into an envelope. "The alibis, the motives, the clues, they were converging, but the picture remained incomplete. The chateau held its secrets tightly, but Poirot, with his relentless logic, would pry them loose under the unforgiving light of the moon." Chapter 5. The Secret of the Tower. The morning of the third day at the Chateau de Varennes dawned with a heavy mist, cloaking the estate in an ethereal haze that seemed to mirror the opacity of the mystery at hand. Hercule Poirot, his mind as sharp as the creases in his immaculate suit, stood in the chateau's courtyard, the damp air brushing his mustache as he contemplated the threads of the case. The green thread, the drop of wax, the chloral hydrate in the wine glass, and the missing emerald necklace formed a constellation of clues, yet their alignment eluded him. The tower, where Victor Morel had claimed to be immersed in his manuscripts, beckoned as the next stage for his investigation. Poirot ascended the spiral staircase to the tower, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning the worn stone walls for any hint of irregularity. The tower room, perched high above the chateau, was a scholar's sanctuary, cluttered with parchment, quills, and maps of Lyon's medieval past. Victor Morel sat at a cluttered desk, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he scribbled notes. He started at Poirot's entrance, his pen dropping with a clatter. "Monsieur Poirot, I did not expect you here." "Monsieur Morel," Poirot said, his voice smooth as velvet. "Your research, it fascinates me. The history of the de Varenne family, the legend of a hidden vault. Such secrets, they are compelling, non?" He gestured to a map on the desk, its edges curling, marked with cryptic annotations. Victor's hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. "It is merely academic interest," he stammered. "The vault is a myth, a story of lost treasures from the Revolution. I have found no proof." His eyes darted to a pile of manuscripts, and Poirot's gaze followed, noting a leather-bound notebook tucked beneath the rest. With a polite smile, Poirot reached for the notebook, ignoring Victor's protest. Its pages were filled with diagrams of the chateau, one detailing a passage behind the library's western wall. "This," Poirot said, holding up the sketch, "is more than myth, I think." Victor's face drained of color, but he remained silent, his lips pressed into a thin line. Poirot summoned Inspector Dubois, who arrived with a constable, his mustache bristling with curiosity. Together, they descended to the library, where the morning light filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the spot where Madame de Varenne had met her end. Following the map's directions, Poirot ran his gloved fingers along the oak paneling near the fireplace. A faint click rewarded his efforts, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Dubois lit a lantern, and the trio ventured down the damp, musty passage. The air grew colder, the walls slick with age. At the bottom, they found a small chamber, its floor covered in dust undisturbed for decades. In a corner, on a stone ledge, lay the emerald necklace, its gems catching the lantern's glow like captured stars. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The necklace. It was not stolen for gain," he murmured. "It was hidden to mislead." Dubois examined the chamber, finding no other exits or signs of recent use. "The killer knew of this place," he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "But why leave the necklace here?" Poirot did not answer, his mind turning over the implications. The necklace's presence suggested the murder was not about theft, but something deeper. Perhaps a desire to obscure the true motive. Back in the library, Poirot re-examined the scene of the crime. The broken wine glass, its shards now confirmed to contain chloral hydrate, intrigued him anew. He knelt by the rug, studying the pattern of the spill. The glass had not merely fallen. Its fragments were scattered in a way that suggested a deliberate smash, perhaps to mask the sedative's presence. He rose, his gaze falling on the dagger case, its empty slot a silent accusation. The precision of the wound, the absence of fingerprints. Every detail pointed to a careful mind, yet the broken glass hinted at a moment of panic. Poirot requested Dr. Fournier's presence, summoning him to the library. The physician entered, his lean frame tense, his eyes wary. "Doctor," Poirot said, his tone disarming, "you are familiar with chloral hydrate, oui? A sedative, useful in your profession. Did you perhaps prescribe it to Madame de Varenne?" Fournier's face hardened. "I prescribed nothing of the sort," he said sharply. "Eloise was in good health, save for her nerves. If chloral hydrate was used, it was not by my hand." His defensiveness was palpable, but Poirot noted the steadiness of his gaze as if he were accustomed to scrutiny. Leaving the library, Poirot sought out Julien de Varenne, finding him in the billiard room, a glass of brandy in hand despite the early hour. "Monsieur Julien," Poirot began, "your aunt's will placed great pressure upon you. Your debts, they are considerable, no?" Julien's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, his fingers tightening around the glass. Poirot leaned closer, his voice low. "I observed a stain on your cuff at dinner, a stain of wine, identical to that spilled in the library. How do you explain this?" Julien's face flushed, his bravado crumbling. I may have spilled some wine earlier," he stammered. "I was in the library before dinner, speaking with Tante Eloise. We argued, yes, but I left her alive." His voice cracked, and Poirot's mustache twitched, sensing truth laced with fear. As the afternoon deepened, Poirot reflected in the chateau's garden, the mist now lifting to reveal the stark beauty of the Rhône Valley. The discovery of the necklace in the hidden chamber shifted the puzzle's shape. The killer had known of the vault, suggesting intimacy with the chateau's secrets. Victor's research, perhaps, or a shared confidence with Madame de Varenne. The sedative pointed to premeditation, yet the dagger's use and the smashed glass suggested a plan gone awry. Julien's stained cuff, Clara's silk scrap, Fournier's expertise, Sophie's obsession with the necklace, Victor's secretive maps. Each was a thread, but the weave remained elusive. Poirot returned to the tower, where Victor still sat, his face a mask of anxiety. "Monsieur Morel," Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm, "the vault was no myth. You knew of its existence, yet you hid this. Why?" Victor's shoulders slumped, and he admitted to discovering the passage weeks ago, but swore he had not entered it until after the murder. "I feared being implicated," he whispered. "The chateau's history, it consumes me." As Poirot descended the tower stairs, the pieces of the puzzle danced in his mind. The killer had planned to incapacitate Madame, perhaps to stage a theft, but had resorted to violence when the plan faltered. The necklace, hidden yet unclaimed, was a feint, a distraction from the true motive. "The little gray cells," Poirot murmured. "They see the pattern emerging, but one thread remains out of reach." The chateau, its stones steeped in centuries of secrets, seemed to watch him as he walked, the moon rising once more to cast its accusatory light. The truth was near, and Poirot would not rest until it was laid bare. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. The sky above the Chateau de Varenne darkened as the third day waned, heavy clouds rolling in from the Rhône Valley, their edges tinged with the ominous glow of the setting sun. Rain began to lash the estate, drumming against the ancient stone walls and rattling the leaded windows. Hercule Poirot, undeterred by the storm's fury, stood in the chateau's grand hall, his small figure a beacon of calm amidst the gathering tempest. The discovery of the emerald necklace in the hidden vault, the trace of chloral hydrate, the green thread, the drop of wax, all were clues that pointed to a crime both calculated and chaotic. Yet the heart of the mystery, the motive that drove the dagger into Madame Eloise de Varenne's chest, remained just beyond his grasp. Tonight, he would stir the waters further, forcing the truth to surface. Poirot summoned the guests to the drawing-room once more. the firelight casting long shadows that danced like specters across the walls. Inspector Dubois stood by the mantel, his burly frame a silent sentinel, his notebook open to record every word. The guests filed in, their faces a gallery of apprehension. Julien de Varenne, his charm eroded by sleeplessness and brandy. Clara Beaumont, her theatrical poise fraying at the edges. Dr. Henri Fournier, his clinical reserve now tinged with wariness. Sophie Lambert, her sharp features set in defiance. And Victor Morel, clutching his notebook as if it could shield him from scrutiny. Gustave and Annette, the butler and maid, lingered at the door, their presence required, but unobtrusive. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice cutting through the room's tension like a scalpel. The murder of Madame de Varenne was no simple act of greed or passion. It was a tapestry woven with intent, yet unraveled by haste. The emerald necklace, found in the hidden vault, was not the prize. It was a deception. The true motive lies elsewhere, in the hearts of those who stood to gain or lose by her death. Let us examine the threads. He turned to the mantel, where he had placed the emerald necklace, its gems glinting in the firelight. A collective gasp rose from the guests. Sophie Lambert's eyes widened, her hand twitching as if to reach for it. Julian's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering to the floor. Clara's breath caught, her fingers twisting her handkerchief. Fournier remained impassive, but Victor's spectacles slipped as he stared, transfixed. The necklace, Poirot continued, was hidden to suggest theft, yet left untouched in a vault known only to a few. This tells us the killer was familiar with the chateau's secrets. He paused, his green eyes sweeping the room. Monsieur Morel, your research uncovered the vault's location. Did you share this knowledge? Victor shook his head vehemently. I told no one, he stammered. I found the passage weeks ago, but I kept it to myself. It was academic curiosity. His voice faltered, and Poirot noted the scholar's pallor, as if the weight of his secrets pressed upon him. Poirot turned to Julien. Monsieur de Varenne, your aunt's will promised you her fortune, but only if you reformed. Your debts, they are a heavy burden. Oui? The stain of wine on your cuff, matching the spill in the library, places you at the scene. Did you seek to force her hand? Julian's face flushed, his cigarette trembling in his fingers. I argued with her, yes, he admitted, his voice hoarse. I begged for money, but she refused. I left her alive, I swear. The wine. I spilled some during our talk, but I didn't kill her. His desperation rang true, yet Poirot's mustache twitched, sensing a half-truth. To Clara, Poirot said, Mademoiselle Beaumont, your silk scrap in the library window and Gustave's sighting of you near the stairs contradict your alibi. You were Madame's protégée, expecting a bequest. Did you seek to secure it? Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, but her voice was steady. I loved Eloise, she said. I went to the library for a book, as I told you. I opened the window, yes, but I saw nothing, heard nothing until the scream. Her theatricality was convincing, but Poirot wondered if it masked a deeper truth. Dr. Fournier faced Poirot's scrutiny next. Doctor, your knowledge of sedatives aligns with the chloral hydrate in the wine glass. Your dispute with Madame over her withdrawn investment suggests resentment. What say you? Fournier's gaze was unflinching. I had no reason to kill her, he said coolly. My clinic survived her withdrawal. As for sedatives, any physician knows them, but I administered none. His calm was almost too perfect, and Poirot filed it away. Sophie Lambert, her ruby brooch a stark contrast to her black gown, met Poirot's gaze with a smirk. "Madame Lambert, your claim to the necklace was a source of bitterness. Did it drive you to act?" "I am no murderer," Sophie snapped. "The necklace was mine by right, but I would not kill for it. I was in the gallery, as I said." Her defiance was unshaken, but Poirot noted the tension in her posture. As the questioning paused, Dubois produced a new clue, a small brass key found in the secret passage engraved with the initials HF. He handed it to Poirot, who held it up to the firelight. "Dr. Fournier," Poirot said, "this key bears your initials. How did it come to be in the vault?" Fournier's composure wavered, his fingers tightening. "It is mine," he admitted, "but I lost it years ago, when I visited Eloise after her husband's death. It must have been found and placed there." His explanation was plausible, but Poirot's eyes narrowed, sensing a thread yet to be pulled. The rain intensified, thunder rumbling as Poirot paced before the fire. "The crime," he said, "was planned with care. The sedative to render Madame helpless, the necklace hidden to suggest theft. Yet the dagger, the smashed glass, they speak of a moment when control was lost. The killer, they are here, watching, listening." The guests exchanged glances, their unease palpable. Poirot dismissed them, but not before requesting Dubois to station constables at the chateau's exits. Alone with the inspector, he shared his thoughts. "The key, it is a clue, but perhaps a planted one," he said. "The motive lies not in the necklace, but in the control of the estate, or the fear of losing it." As the storm raged outside, Poirot stood at the drawing-room window, the rain streaking the glass like tears. The clues were aligning: the key, the thread, the wax, the sedative, but the final piece eluded him. The chateau, its secrets locked in stone and shadow, seemed to challenge him. Yet Poirot, with his relentless logic, knew the truth was near, waiting to be unveiled in the storm's unyielding light. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of the Truth. The storm that battered the Chateau de Varennes had subsided by the fourth evening, leaving a sky pricked with stars and a moon that cast its accusatory light through the library's tall windows. Hercule Poirot, his mind a crucible of deduction, had summoned the guests for a final reckoning in the very room where Madame Eloise de Varennes had met her end. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and the lingering tang of tragedy. The armchair where the widow had died now standing empty, a silent witness to the crime. Inspector Dubois stood by the door, his burly frame tense, his notebook at the ready. The guests, their faces etched with dread and anticipation, gathered in a semicircle. Julien de Varennes, his eyes shadowed by guilt. Clara Beaumont, her theatrical poise brittle. Dr. Henri Fournier, his calm fraying at the edges. Sophie Lambert, her defiance tempered by unease. And Victor Morel, his spectacles glinting nervously. Gustave and Annette, the butler and maid, hovered at the rear, their expressions guarded. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his small figure commanding the room, his green eyes sharp as cut emeralds. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice a velvet blade. "The murder of Madame de Varennes was a crime of opportunity, disguised as calculation. The clues, the emerald necklace, the chloral hydrate, the dagger, the green thread, the wax, the key, they form a tapestry. And tonight, Hercule Poirot shall unravel it." He paced, his hands clasped behind his back, the firelight casting his shadow long and lean. "Let us reconstruct the night of the crime. Madame de Varenne, a woman of wealth and will, was a figure of contention. Her fortune, her necklace, her expectations, they stirred desires in this house. The killer planned to incapacitate her with chloral hydrate, slipped into her wine, perhaps to coerce or to steal. But when the plan faltered, a dagger from the display case became the instrument of death, and the glass was smashed to hide the sedative's presence." He turned to the guests, his gaze piercing. "Each of you had a motive, a shadow in your heart. Monsieur Morel, your research on the chateau's vault gave you knowledge of its secrets, but your fear of implication kept you silent. Your motive was curiosity, not murder." Victor exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief, though his eyes remained wary. "Madame Lambert," Poirot continued, "your claim to the emerald necklace was a fire in your soul, but your pride would not stoop to bloodshed. You coveted, but you did not kill." Sophie's lips parted, her ruby brooch catching the light as she nodded, her defiance softened by vindication. To Clara, Poirot said, "Mademoiselle Beaumont, your presence in the library, marked by the green thread, and your expectation of a bequest gave you reason to act. Yet your tears, your dramatics, they are the tools of the stage, not the guile of a murderer." Clara's hand flew to her chest, her relief tempered by the weight of suspicion lifted. "Dr. Fournier," Poirot said, his tone sharpening, "your knowledge of sedatives and the key bearing your initials pointed to you. But the key, lost years ago, was a plant, and your resentment, though real, lacked the venom for murder." Fournier's jaw relaxed, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of gratitude. Poirot paused, letting the tension build, then turned to Julien de Varenne. "Monsieur Julien, you stand at the heart of this tragedy. Your debts, your argument with your aunt, the wine stain on your cuff, your presence near the library, they weave a noose around you. You sought her fortune, bound by the conditions of her will. You slipped chloral hydrate into her wine, hoping to render her unconscious, perhaps to forge a change in her will, or to steal the necklace as a desperate measure." Julien's cigarette fell from his fingers, his face ashen. "No," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Poirot pressed on, relentless. But Madame awoke, her strength defying the sedative. In panic, you seized the dagger from the case, a weapon of opportunity, and struck her heart. The glass you smashed to mask the drug, and the necklace you hid in the vault, hoping to suggest a thief from outside. But the window, left ajar with no footprints, betrayed you. The wax on the sill, from a candle you carried to light the passage, sealed your guilt. Julien staggered, his bravado crumbling. "I didn't mean to kill her," he cried, his voice breaking. "I only wanted the money. She was going to give it all to that cousin. I put the sedative in her wine, yes, to make her sign a new will. But she woke, she fought me, called me a disgrace. I grabbed the dagger, I didn't think." Tears streamed down his face as he collapsed into a chair, his confession echoing in the silent room. Dubois stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting in the firelight. "Julien de Varenne, you are under arrest for the murder of Eloise de Varenne," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The constable led Julien away, his sobs fading down the hall. The remaining guests stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Poirot addressed them one final time. "The truth, It is a harsh light, but it dispels the shadows. Madame de Varennes' death was a tragedy born of greed and desperation, but it is resolved. As the group dispersed, Clara's tears genuine at last, Sophie's head bowed, Fournier's gaze distant, and Victor clutching his notebook, Poirot remained in the library. Dubois approached, his mustache twitching with admiration. "Monsieur Poirot, your little gray cells, they are a marvel. How did you know the wax was the final clue?" Poirot's lips curved in a faint smile. "The wax, Inspector, was unscented, unlike the chateau's tapers. Only someone entering the dark passage would carry such a candle, and Julien, in his haste, left it behind. The little gray cells, they notice what others overlook." The inspector shook his hand, and Poirot stepped to the window, the moonlight now soft, unaccusing. The chateau, its secrets laid bare, seemed to exhale, its stones lighter for the truth revealed. Yet Poirot's mind, ever restless, already turned to the next puzzle, somewhere beyond the horizon, where human nature's complexities awaited his unerring logic. Chapter 8. The moon sets. The dawn of the 5th day broke over the Chateau de Varennes with a quiet serenity, the storm's fury a memory as sunlight filtered through the Rhône Valley's mist, gilding the estate's turrets and ivy-clad walls. Hercule Poirot, his suitcase packed with the precision of a military campaign, stood in the chateau's courtyard, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the dew underfoot. The mystery of Madame Heloise de Varennes' murder had been solved, the threads of motive, opportunity, and deceit woven into a tapestry of truth by his relentless little gray cells. Yet, as always, the resolution of a crime left Poirot reflective, his mind turning over the frailties of human nature that had brought such tragedy to this grand house. The chateau, once alive with secrets, now felt subdued, its halls echoing with the weight of Julien de Varennes' confession. The young, ere now in the custody of Inspector Dubois, had acted out of desperation, his greed and fear transforming a plan of coercion into a fatal act. The emerald necklace, returned to its rightful place in the family's vault, had been a mere prop in his clumsy deception, its brilliance overshadowed by the darkness of his deed. The green thread, the wax, the chloral hydrate, all had pointed to Julien, and Poirot's meticulous logic had left no room for doubt. As Poirot prepared to depart, Inspector Dubois approached, his burly frame softened by a rare smile. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending a hand, "your reputation is well earned. Lyon will speak of this case for years, and I am honored to have witnessed your method." Poirot bowed slightly, his mustache twitching with modest pride. "The little gray cells, Inspector, they do their work when order and method are applied, but I thank you for your assistance. The truth, it requires both our efforts." The remaining guests gathered in the grand hall to bid him farewell, their faces marked by the strain of the past days. Clara Beaumont, her auburn hair tied back, offered a tremulous smile, her theatricality subdued by genuine gratitude. "Monsieur Poirot, you've given us closure," she said softly. "Heloise would have been proud." Poirot noted the sincerity in her eyes, a far cry from her earlier dramatics. Sophie Lambert, her ruby brooch replaced by a simple scarf, inclined her head. "I misjudged you," she admitted, her sharp tone softened. "The necklace was never worth this pain." Her concession was rare, and Poirot acknowledged it with a nod, sensing her bitterness had begun to fade. Dr. Henri Fournier, his physician's reserve intact, shook Poirot's hand firmly. "You saw through the shadows, monsieur," he said. "I am glad to be cleared, though the loss of Eloise weighs heavily." His words carried a professional detachment, but Poirot detected a flicker of relief. Victor Morel, clutching his notebook, stammered his thanks. "Your insight, it spared me unjust suspicion," he said, his spectacles fogging slightly. "I will confine my studies to safer histories." Poirot smiled faintly, suspecting the scholar would soon be lost in another ancient mystery. Gustave and Annette, the loyal butler and maid, stood at the door, their faces etched with quiet gratitude. "Monsieur Poirot," Gustave said, his voice steady, "you have restored order to this house." Annette, her eyes no longer fearful, curtsied shyly. Poirot tipped his hat, appreciating their steadfast service amidst the chaos. As the footman loaded his suitcase into a waiting car, Poirot took a final look at the chateau, its stones bathed in the soft light of morning. The moon, now waning, had set hours ago, its accusatory glow replaced by the promise of a new day. Yet Poirot knew that the shadows of human nature, greed, desperation, ambition, would cast their webs elsewhere, in another time, another place. The car carried him to Lyons Station, where the Orient Express awaited to return him to London. As the train wound through the French countryside, Poirot sipped a tisane, his mind already wandering beyond the chateau's walls. The case was closed, the murderer apprehended, but the world, he knew, was a tapestry of puzzles, each waiting for his unique blend of intuition and logic. He leaned back, his green eyes half closed, and murmured to himself, "The little gray cells, they never fail. But the heart of man, it is a mystery eternal." The train's rhythm lulled him, and as the fields of France gave way to the horizon, Hercule Poirot prepared for the next challenge, wherever it might lie.